And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the original mothership at coalitionradio.us. An organization joins us tonight that has been on, well, virtually every format that we've appeared on, going back to Coalition 1.0. They speak to, and their origins are, if you will, cut from the very fiber that we admire so much. And of course, we're talking about your right to free speech, the First Amendment. Campus free speech has been a part of, if you will, in my sights really since I graduated from college. I had a conversation with a few of the folks from FIRE online the other day, and it turns out that a gentleman named Nat Hentoff, who meant so much to me as I came out of college in the 80s, has a seminal role, if you will, in this organization as well. If you're not familiar with Nat Hentoff, he, astonishingly enough, he was both the jazz writer and the free speech writer for the Village Voice, back when the Village Voice was perhaps the most important independent newspaper in the country. And some could argue really created, if you will, the entire category of being an indie newspaper. And it is to the Village Voice that this effort, the Coalition Radio, or the Coalition Radio Network as we call ourselves now, really pays homage to. And Nat Hentoff was, I don't know if he coined the phrase, but he certainly popularized it at the time. And he wrote a book called Free Speech for Me, Not for Thee. And in the 80s, discussed the origins, if you will, of campus free speech. And the beginning, in its infancy, trends like free speech zones, which sound really cool until you find out what they really mean. We'll discuss a little bit of that tonight. And the notion of a college administration and or college faculty that sought to, well, and it almost doesn't matter which side, if you will. I'm not big on sides here. But early on, whether it be a college or a university that had a cultural conservative background, or a college or university that sought to promote itself as a free-thinking organization, both of them were equally detrimental to the notion of free speech on campus. So against that backdrop, we were fortunate enough to meet a few years back folks from FIRE, and they are the leading organization in America litigating on behalf of, advocating for your rights on a college campus to free speech. And of course, we're going to discuss the irony of that statement, because ultimately the university setting, the format, if you will, the bricks and mortar are, well, dedicated to free thought, right? I'm old enough to remember when that was a reality, but it's not anymore. And there's real tragedy there, because critical thinking is often a function of early on in one's life being able to engage in free thought and free speeching. And so it is with great pleasure that I introduce Katlyn Patton. She is an attorney with FIRE, and FIRE stands for Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. She's a graduate of Case Western Law and is an active litigant on behalf of free speech rights in the university setting. Ms. Patton, welcome to the Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've already had a long and engaging day professionally, and so your willingness to work late for us is truly appreciated.
Absolutely, Pat. Thanks for having me.
So let's start from the beginning a little bit. It's been a while since, during the Rona, there's been a lot of, chaos and confusion, if you will, in terms of work hours and, how we can get a hold of people. And it's been a challenge with all the organizations that we represent, because sadly, free speech rights have not said, you know what, we're going to take a break during the Rona. We're going to respect the fact that there's a lot of challenges in how we deliver education to our young people. So we're just going to take a break on infringing on them. And at the same time, the workplace environment itself has been chaos. And of course, I'm being facetious on all of that. But tell us a little bit about the origins of FIRE and what the real focus is on.
Absolutely. So FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, is an organization that's a little over 20 years old. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to advocating and now litigating on behalf of student and faculty rights on campuses across the United States. So that includes expressive rights, due process rights, and we engage in informal advocacy. We engage in shedding light on these issues through speaking with people like you, Pat, through our own publications, as well as, when necessary, taking these issues to the courts.
What was, if you will, was there a set of events that precipitated the creation of FIRE? I mean, and in following up with that, what is the state of free speech on campus today?
So in terms of a set of events that led our founders to establish FIRE, I can't point to necessarily a specific incident. I know that their goal was, we see this issue, let's found this organization, and our goal will be to put ourselves out of business, to stop schools from infringing on student and faculty's expressive rights. That, of course, over 20 years later, has unfortunately not been the case. Schools continue to infringe on student and faculty rights. And frankly, 2020 was one of FIRE's busiest years to date. Our individual rights defense program absolutely had the busiest year they've ever had. I don't know the numbers offhand, but there's articles on our website, the FIRE News Desk, that go into more detail about the number of submissions we got last year involving infringement on student and faculty rights that we were getting directly from students and faculty, that we were seeing reported in the news, that we were seeing on social media. And 2021 hasn't really shown any signs of slowing down.
And yet, as is so often the case in history, so much of this is sort of on auto replay. We've got clearly a university environment for which there seems to be this self-policing in terms of speech, while those very individuals often claim that the university environment is the ideal world, if you will, to engage in that sort of the ruminations, the debate, the late night arguments, the passion of ideas. How is it that one large group of people cannot see well, let's be blunt, a lot of the hypocrisy in their statements versus their actions? And how is it that we're having the same conversations we were, like I said, back when Nat Hentoff was in his prime?
It's hard to pin down an exact reason for why that's happening. I think there could be several. I think that it's common to see schools paying lip service, as you're saying, to expressive rights, to the First Amendment. As we know, public schools are expressly bound by the First Amendment. Private schools as well make strong commitments to their students that they will enjoy their expressive rights on campus, only to come to campus and find that is not the case at all. And it's a serious problem. It's something that, our president and CEO, Greg Lukianoff, has explored on his blog on our website, The Eternally Radical Idea, about the corporatization of campuses and why we might be seeing the issues that we're seeing. But it's a really hard thing to nail down exactly why this is happening. But we know that it is happening at an alarming rate.
Now, one of the most important products, if you will, in the sense of public information, is your annual report card, if you will, on college free speech rankings. Talk about that effort, because it's astonishing the breadth of universities and both private and public that you focus on when you do this report. Maybe just tell us a little bit about the process there.
Absolutely. So I believe you're referring to the Spotlight report, where we survey like hundreds. Yes, absolutely. So our policy reform team works diligently every year to review policies and update the Spotlight report to see what's changed, to try to survey new schools. And that is a months-long effort by attorneys who are, trained and skilled and do this every year and know exactly what they're looking for and can see, this changed this policy means it doesn't get fires, green light, highest rating anymore, or maybe there's a change that our policy reform team has worked with administrators to make, and now that policy is a green light. But it's a very long and diligent work process by our policy reform team to review all of those policies each year.
Right. And when it comes out, when the 2021 version comes out, it's something I hope to have you folks on and maybe go through. But just, and again, this is all can be found on thefire.org. That's the website. It's one of the things we often talk about on the Coalition Radio Network is these, I'll call them loosely think tanks, but there's so much more. They're institutions of thought, they're institutions of litigation, they're institutions of education now. Think tanks are no longer a group of hidebound academics sitting in a locked room somewhere. Think tanks have emerged into these multifaceted, multiple, if you will, approach organizations that deliver so much to the public. So as I often say, thefire.org is one of those websites which you can engage in primary reading and primary discussions at a high level of issues surrounding free speech, and really should be one of your first resources before you go to, if you will, the mainstream media, which tends to, if you will, homogenize the issue and crush it. But I just want to point out in the 2020 version, and this is kind of the surprises that you find in this every year, a perennial front runner, the University of Chicago, gets the highest rating, and anyone who's followed the University of Chicago understands that they've got a commitment to independent thought as part of their overall education. That is astonishing. They are, if anything, slaves to independent thought, if that's at all possible. So it's not surprising to see that. Now, typically you publish the top 50. What is very surprising, or top 50 or so, is to see universities like Georgetown at number 48. And Dartmouth College at number 52. And also the University of Texas at Austin, which is similarly in the red. Dartmouth in the yellow. And again, look at the report. There's a whole color scheme rating here, and there's all sorts of barometers that they use. But again, the conventional wisdom, if you heard the University of Chicago, a lot of folks who are cultural conservatives might dismiss that school as being liberal and demeaning towards free speech, when again they are anything but. And one would assume that a great university like Dartmouth, an Ivy League, and the one that is often accorded the notion of being the most conservative, if you will, in its approach to education and to economics, is in fact, yikes. Holy cow, that's something I want to discuss in the future. But again, this is the overall perspective and the information that thefire.org delivers on a regular basis. Now, in your daily life with The Fire, you're focused heavily on litigation. And how does a college go from doing something really stupid, and we're going to talk about one in particular who seems to be a repeat offender here with thefire.org. But how does one go to that, to one's, in terms of information coming to The Fire and then ultimately somehow end up in your hands? That's got to be a wild little process there.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you were saying, there's a lot of resources for people on our website, thefire.org. One of those resources is a tool that allows students and faculty to submit a case to Fire. Mm-hmm. The term case used loosely, any set of facts that you feel that your rights are being infringed on campus. Students can submit those instances on our website. They're reviewed typically within 24 hours by members of our advocacy team, our individual rights defense program, who are typically the first line of defense for student and faculty rights. And the situation will be evaluated. Perhaps Fire will write a letter. You probably see on our website, Fire writes a lot of letters to universities that are infringing on student or faculty rights. Ultimately, if we can't come to a resolution, or if the case is really ripe for litigation, at that point, it might be passed off to our in-house litigation team, which would be myself and my colleagues, at which point we would go through the process of actually filing a lawsuit.
How often does it get to that point? I guess to someone like myself, for whom the First Amendment, and actually I'm one of those guys who believes in all of them. I don't selectively cherry pick, the first, and I always tease my Republican friends about, the fact that there is life beyond the Second Amendment. There's the Fourth, which is kind of kooky, but pretty important. And then there's that whole First Amendment thing. And then there's that, if you support prisoner rights like I do, there's that whole notion of cruel and unusual punishment. So, sometimes we have to remind different groups of the entire range that our Constitution, our Bill of Rights offers. But let's dive into a specific case in the time we've got, and a specific university. Now, there's a little bit of education to be had here because the Haskell Indian Nations University, there's a mouthful, has been a repeat offender on a couple of occasions here. First of all, if you could just shed a little light on us about the role of the Bureau of Indian Education and kind of where it stands in terms of the university world, because that I'll be honest, I think I'm fairly well read, but until you folks started tangling with them a year or two ago, I wasn't familiar with the Bureau of Indian Education. Are they part of a sovereign nation? Are they part of the American university system? Give us a little background there.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely confusing, and this is a unique element to this case that differs from a lot of FIRE's other cases. So Haskell Indian Nations University is a university that is not part of a sovereign tribe. It's on, regular municipal land in Lawrence, Texas, but it is run by the Bureau of Indian Education, which is part of the United States Department of the Interior. It's an arm of the federal government. Haskell is one of only two similar universities that are directly operated by the BIE. The other one is, I believe, in New Mexico. So it is a bit of a unique institution in that regard, that it's not a state school, but it's not, a tribal school either. It's a school run by the federal government that is intended to provide, an affordable higher education to Native students.
Right. So we've got a real tangled web here. And again, this is not the first time Haskell has come into your sites, if you will. But if I get the breakdown here, first of all, you've got a university president saying essentially you will not say bad things about the administration. Where do you get to do that? And in terms of your investigation, was there ever an attempt to explain under what thought process that the president of the university thought he could quell, much like a tin pot dictator, my words, not yours, individual expression about his day-to-day job performance? I mean, how do we get to this point?
That's a great question, Pat. I guess going back to last fall when we first learned about the president's directive against the student journalist Jared Nally, who is the plaintiff in our lawsuit, FIRE did attempt to write a letter, as we do, to President Graham and say, excuse me, sir, this is completely inconsistent with the First Amendment, and you are the president of a public federal institution. So there was an attempt to explain, you cannot just say, student journalist, you're not allowed to ask questions. Student journalists, you're not allowed to, quote unquote, attack people with letters, AKA asking questions in written form. And we didn't receive a satisfactory response to that. We wrote another letter pre-litigation pointing out again that this was a problem, that they have policies that are a problem. We, again, didn't receive a satisfactory explanation or any explanation at all. So that's kind of how we got to this point.
Forgive me if I have the mission of a college student newspaper, but isn't it almost expected that the college student newspaper be an irritant, in often very childlike ways, but still an irritant to university administrations? I mean, I know from my education, which, part of which, of course, consists of watching one of the greatest American motion pictures of all time, Animal House, that students exist to irritate the administration and make all sorts of sometimes great, sometimes insane demands. how does one think that one can avoid that in a university setting? It's a rite of passage, isn't it?
I would say so, and I certainly agree with you based on my experience in undergrad and our student paper. I think that it's a clear sign to me and to us at FIRE, and I think to student journalists overall, that administrators should be answering questions. They shouldn't be forbidding students, especially student journalists, from asking them. And the fact that Haskell has tried to do that here is just a further sign that they need to be held accountable by a robust student press. And clearly, they would prefer not to be.
I mean, I go back to my college days, and my first controversial speech in front of any sort of body whatsoever, no, my second one, was the student body council actually hired John Holmes, who in the early 80s was a notorious adult movie star, to come onto campus. And it was almost like out of the movies, because there was this big trial, right? Almost a trial, big hearing. Half the college was there. And, the faculty was railing on them. A couple of the neocon conservative types, we didn't call them that, of course, were railing on the perfidy, if you will, the sexuality of having an adult male entertainment star come onto campus. And then I meekly raised my hands and said, but I'm confused. The university bookstore sells Penthouse. And at which point in time, chaos ensued, just like in the movies. People were throwing up letters and stuff like that. And that was the end of the trial. But on a serious note here, when you send a demand letter, I'm assuming it's some form of demand letter to them, are you giving them the legal roadmap under which they are in error of?
Yes, absolutely. So that is essentially exactly what FIRE's letters do. Of course, when you get down the road in litigation, you're filing motions, you're filing briefs, there's a more thorough discussion, but the letters do really lay out the roadmap. This is the right that you're infringing specifically. These are the cases that say that you can't do this, and showing them what they're doing wrong.
And at this point, if I can use the vernacular, do most universities turtle, as they say? Do they go into hiding and not respond, and what happened in this situation?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. I wouldn't say most universities go into hiding and don't respond. That's definitely one of an array of responses that we get. Essentially turtle, ignore us. Some universities think that's the best course of action because they think that maybe then FIRE won't go public. Then there's, of course, the universities that respond with some form of attempt to argue that they are right. And then there are the universities that cave and say, yes, you're right, this was the wrong choice. And to the extent that they do that in response to a demand letter, then there's no litigation necessary. Here, we wrote a letter to Haskell back in October, almost directly after Graham told Jared Nally, the student journalist, that he needed to stop asking questions and threatened him with discipline, and did not receive a response. Then in January, the directive that told Jared that he could not ask questions anymore was rescinded. However, we still had some concerns about policies that Haskell maintains, and wrote a letter explaining what these concerns were, explaining that we also had concerns about the recognition of the student newspaper, the Indian Leader. We did not receive a response to that letter, at which point we filed a lawsuit. Then this past month, there were some separate directives, essentially, that were not directly addressed to students. They involved faculty and staff who the president described as detractors. I think this was likely, but not necessarily, I can't conclusively say, in response to negative media attention after the lawsuit. And FIRE did write a letter about that and did receive a timely response from the BIE rescinding that directive. So it seemed like the feds are starting to pay attention. But that's the long saga of how we got where we are here and how Haskell has responded.
Now, very often, and for example, here in Rhode Island, the ACLU had a major victory in terms of affirming, if you will, the rights of the individual to panhandle. And I'm sure you've, as a civil libertarian, I'm sure you've seen those type of cases all around the country. And a local municipality engaged in a consent decree. So it didn't really go. We didn't have the big dramatic courtroom scene, but at the same time, a new mayor realized the error of their ways and understood that a potential lawsuit they would lose, and it would be ruinous financially. At the same time, said municipality did have to go out of pocket to the ACLU. In terms of, and I'm asking this because I want to give a picture of why it's important to support your organization, not just morally, not just with wow, those are great fellas and gals, but actually, at some point in time, either stroke a check or or send some type of financial support. Do you get any recovery? In generally speaking, I'm not looking to get specific here, but is there a road to recovery for your expenses when you have to litigate against these universities?
So generally speaking, way down the road at the end of litigation, assuming we are what's called the prevailing party, there's a way to recover costs. Typically, there's litigation about what those costs should be. So there is some way to recover costs, but up front, generally, we're representing these students and faculty pro bono in an effort to vindicate their rights and to move the law in the right direction. For people who are interested in supporting FIRE, you can donate on our website, and we have an excellent development team if you want to talk to someone individually.
Excellent. So right now, the free speech is alive and well at the Haskell Indian Nation University. Any sense that they've learned their lesson and we won't be hearing from them again?
We'll see. I think that rescinding the directive recently, the one against faculty, is a good sign, but we are still not sure about how they're going to respond to our lawsuit as it pertains to student rights and the rights of the student press on campus. So stay tuned.
All right. So the litigation is ongoing then. They've withdrawn if you will, the public order. But is it your intent to set precedent here?
Absolutely. For one, because this is a very unique institution in terms of a defendant, as we discussed earlier, they're run by the federal government. Most of the student speech cases that are out there are against either public K-12 schools or against state universities, as well as just setting, more recent and solid precedent related to the rights of the student press. Excellent.
So as it were, it continues. Now, you were involved also briefly in a Rhode Island situation. I bring that home because for folks who may hear this for the first time now or in the future, the Coalition Radio Network is based in Providence, Rhode Island. Interesting to see in the 2020 report, I call it your report card, that Brown University actually did relatively well, which is surprising because for many of us politically on a local level, Brown University has a tendency to be heavy-handed from an outside perspective. But you were engaged in a case at the University of Rhode Island, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So recently there was a case at the University of Rhode Island. I believe you're referring to the parking ticket case.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. So we did recently write into URI about a student who was threatened with discipline after he received a parking ticket. It seems like this student had possibly received several parking tickets and was very dissatisfied with the way the university parking is run and was threatened with discipline. FIRE did write in on his behalf to try to, defend his right to use colorful language to express his dissatisfaction with the university's handling of their parking services.
And because ultimately there is still a fundamental right to be rude, right, in this nation, the last time I checked. I say that asking for a friend, as you folks say. Because I hope you'll call me the day being rude becomes illegal, because I'm in a lot of trouble. And you could ask our governor. So I again, in a situation like that, it sounds humorous, but it's not, because they pretty much put the smack down on this guy, didn't they? And you've got universities have a unique relationship with their students, and they can be pretty arbitrary and, as we say here in Rhode Island, capricious in terms of the reactions to what in the real world would just be an argument and some scowls and a few Nancy glances. Talk about the student, if you will, the very often the lack or the minimal due process that's involved in student, I'll call them prosecution/persecutions.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, for this student at URI, while Fire takes no position about whether he should have gotten a parking ticket, he certainly has the right to engage in rude and colorful language to dispute his parking ticket without being threatened with discipline by the university. And as you allude to, colleges and universities seem to mete out discipline sometimes in an arbitrary manner, sometimes without, the notice that due process demands, and the sanctions that those disciplinary processes can carry and the real effects they can have on students. It almost seems like schools don't take those as seriously as they should. Even what an administrator might think is a small fine for a student could be a very big deal. And then, of course, you go down the line to probation, disciplinary suspension, things like that. And students deserve due process when those disciplinary proceedings are being carried out.
Now, I'm going to throw out a couple of concepts here in the few minutes that we've got left. Talk to me about what the status is on campuses. I alluded to in my opening about something called a free speech zone. And there's a deep-seated irony there, of course. And for folks who aren't familiar with free speech zones, the last time I ran into a free speech zone was when I was visiting Georgetown University, who seems to continue to occupy near the cellar, if you will, on your what I call your report card. But a free speech zone is actually anything but, isn't it? And in a free speech zone, you get to have free speech. Now, where does Fire find a problem with that? Because it sounds great. And you get this little section of campus where you can get up and you can say anything you want. What's the issue there, if you could explain to our listeners?
Sure. So a free speech zone, I guess, to help further explain what they typically are a small, typically area of campus where the school says, this is where you have free speech. But for state campuses, it's public property. You have your First Amendment rights generally, and the school can enact reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on that speech, but restricting it to a teeny tiny area for a teeny tiny time does not satisfy that test. So, for example, the recent Supreme Court case against Georgia Gwinnett College originated with a tiny free speech zone where the student wanted to discuss his religious beliefs. Now, the case itself had to do with whether there was an actual injury for him not having been able to speak when and where he wanted to. But the origination of the case was that there was this tiny free speech zone. He could only speak at certain times in certain areas. And the school actually changed that policy because free speech zones are not a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction typically. So that's some background on free speech zones.
So to me, and again, these free speech zones were one of the first, if you will, repression of First Amendment issues that emerged on campus from my personal experience in the 70s and 80s. And considering that I'm old enough to remember the 60s through the viewpoint of my older sisters on campus, and you think about years like 1969 and 1970, where open demonstrations were the rule. It's astonishing that very, very often some of the same faculty who came of age in this riotous time, otherwise known as the Summer of Love and the years immediately preceding and post it, that they would allow this to happen. Because the other pernicious form of behavior that seems still to be the rule of day is, I'll call it the shoutdowns. I know there's a number of terms out there, but are you still seeing a lot of campus environments? And we had this at Brown University, where then I believe is the former police chief of the city of New York came and was shouted down and shouted out of the building. That sort of mob rule that would rather prohibit, if by their definition, by the individual definition of speech that's not compatible with their standard of behavior, versus a true free speech environment, which allows even the most reprehensible to speak. What's that like on campus these days?
Yeah, so that's definitely something that FIRE sees. I think there's something on our website, again, a resource that people are looking for, called the Disinvitation Database that's updated periodically.
Wow.
So that is an example of, as you were saying, in people being invited to campus by students, by the school, whoever, who are, not permitted to end up continuing to speak. I can send you a link if you can't find it right now, but that is something that we certainly see. Then there's the concept of, a heckler's veto, in that maybe someone's supposed to come and then there's so much backlash against that speaker coming that the event itself is canceled. And if the school is the one canceling the event, they're really giving in to a heckler's veto. And that's certainly something that we still see on campus.
Right. And it's, in the age of Trump, it's interesting what's been redefined as, eligible for the heckler's veto. And I as much as I hate the behavior, I love the term, because that's really a pretty, both a provocative and evocative way of describing, if you will, this sort of mob rule that would seek to banish unpleasantries from our language. And what I mean by our language, not necessarily the English language, but the culture's language, that somehow by eliminating unpleasantries, that will prevent the nasty side effects of the belief system that stimulates that individual speech to occur. And I think we all know that that's simply not true. Freedom of association is something that's not fully understood on college campuses anymore. And obviously I'm painting with a very broad brush, but do you see, just as kind of a final thought before we engage in what I lovingly refer to as shameless self-promotion, do you see the tide turning at all, or does what's euphemistically called the cancel culture now, and is that gaining in strength? Is there any chance of a backlash against that, so free speech can actually occur on campuses?
I think that we're at kind of a flashpoint on that note, if I could say that, where it could go in either direction, and I am not sure that I can predict which way it's going to go. Of course, FIRE will stand by to protect student and faculty rights ongoing, whether that becomes a harder job or an easier one.
That's excellent. So again, let's engage in shameless self-promotion. Tell us how folks, what they can find at thefire.org, how they can find different publications. If you can give us a couple of your social media links. I know I follow the FIRE, and it's great because I get constantly refreshed on the Facebook with the latest, again, perfidy that's being performed at our area universities. And I think it's important to follow an organization like yours, not just because of the good work you do, because you get a real sense of the challenges out there. It's interesting, in Rhode Island, they just passed legislation at one level requiring a civics education as part of the public high school curriculum requirement, which was kind of a wow moment. And it was actually a number of students on the left at the high school level who immediately post-high school filed a lawsuit against the state. Ultimately, the lawsuit was dismissed, but the case was clearly made that you had young people craving for an understanding of their civil liberties and their civil rights so that they could protect them and fight authoritarian challenges to them. How's that for refreshing, right? That's clearly not the case. Clearly not the case nationally. So just give us the rundown how folks can stay in touch with you, and I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a trend. Now that we're in our new digs, that we'll have you folks on often whenever these flare-ups occur.
Yeah, I'm sure we'd love to, and some of my colleagues would love to come on and talk to you. If you want to see more about what FIRE's doing, we are online at thefire.org. We're also on Facebook, and then we have a Twitter handle. It's thefire.org, and you can click on our website on News Desk to see what's going on in campus free speech and campus due process. We post several times a week. You can also look at our Spotlight report to see how your university stacks up against other universities in terms of their written policies on speech. And you can also see our periodic press releases or sign up for emails to get real-time updates on what's happening on campus.
Excellent. Well, Attorney Patton, thank you for joining us tonight. Thanks for bringing us up to speed. Again, it's thefire.org. It's one of a dozen or so websites, organizations like the Goldwater Group and FEE, that you really need to make part of your if you will, must reads. Because if one is to intelligently and at the same time provocatively challenge, if you will, these continual attacks on our fundamental rights, one needs to be well educated. And, you know, we don't really engage in this sort of anti-mainstream media attacks that take place on so many individual video blogs and podcasts. We just don't really do that here. I would much rather point out proactively organizations where you can sort of transcend that style of media and gain through the eyes of folks like Katlyn Patton a more thorough understanding of what's at stake, so that one, in a sense, can become their own First Amendment warrior and carry the conversation beyond, if you will, the capabilities of a single organization. And again, one more time, how can folks donate?
So you can donate on our website. I believe it's just thefire.org/donate. We also have a great development team if you're interested in talking to anyone about your donation.
Very good. Attorney Patton, thank you so much for joining us again, and I hope we get to talk again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pat.
We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. We hope you'll take a moment after hearing this, either whether you heard live tonight or in repeat throughout the week, that you'll take a moment to follow both of us, the Fire and the Coalition. It is through independent media, through independent organizations like the Fire, that we can really educate ourselves in fighting for our civil rights. It's through following us on social media that you allow organizations like ourselves to rise above the noise that has become media in general. Both organizations here in tonight's show are completely clickbait free and focused exclusively on real issues. Folks, we're going to be back online tonight at 7:30. Pump up the volume. Dr. Luis Daniel Munoz and his crew, myself included, will join together to talk about the issues of the day. We will see you at 7:30 sharp, and we should have additional programming after that. We'll be back soon.